The snowfall came quiet as breath, fine as sifted flour, tumbling through a pale sky onto rusted iron rails that stretched toward nowhere. The station sat alone, more shadow than shelter, a wind-bitten box of wood and frost-glazed glass. Behind it, the prairie sprawled wide and indifferent, wearing winter like a funeral shawl. The train had gone 10 minutes before, its whistle now a ghost in the hills, and the girl sat on a bench left colder by absence. She was too small for her coat and too still for her years. Pale blue dress, faded at the knees. Fingers clutched a satchel with knuckles white as linen. Her boots didn't match. She stared straight ahead as if willing herself invisible. One gloved hand rested on a folded letter. The name on the envelope had already begun to blur under melting snow. The widower arrived late, as he always did since losing the habit of hurrying. His wagon creaked like old bones. A mule named Betsy huffed puffs of steam into the cold. He stepped down slow, every joint remarking the season. Tall, quiet, neither young nor old, just weathered the way fence posts get, still upright after many storms. He glanced toward the platform, meaning to ignore anything that wasn't crates or barrels. But there she was, not crying, not pleading, just sitting. The station master looked up from his paper and muttered, "Been here near 2 hours now. Bride for a man up north. He never came." The widower said nothing, just looked once more, then turned to load the feed sacks into his wagon. Snow crunched. The wind whispered of forgotten things. She's got no money, no folks. The man prepaid only the one-way fare. "You believe that?" the station master added, rubbing his hands together by the stove. "Said she was too scrawny, anyhow. Didn't want her after all." The girl didn't move. She'd heard every word, but she didn't blink. That was what caught the widower's breath. Not her sorrow, not her sighs, her stillness. Like a deer who's already decided whether it will run or fall. He finished loading, reined in the mule. The station master tipped his hat and muttered something about Sunday's weather. He was already seated when he looked back again. She hadn't moved. "Where you headed?" he asked, voice low as dusk. She turned her head, not startled, not hopeful. "Nowhere," she said, soft as a sigh. He nodded once. "Town's a few miles. Got a room above the store, maybe." She didn't answer. "You can ride along if you want," he added. Still she hesitated. "Cold don't care whose hand it bites." She rose, stiffly, as though her body had only just remembered it belonged to her. She climbed into the wagon without grace, without complaint, sat on the far edge of the seat, and kept both hands folded in her lap. They rode in silence. The wind whispered through brittle weeds. The wheels creaked like old secrets. Every so often he'd glance at her. She didn't shiver, though her coat had lost most of its warmth years ago. Her chin stayed high, her eyes fixed on the white horizon. "You got a name?" he asked, not expecting an answer. She gave one, quiet, plain. He gave his, slower, as though unsure he still deserved to say it out loud. Snow began to gather on the brim of his hat, on the folds of her skirt. She brushed none of it off. He offered her the blanket from behind the seat. She took it after a moment's pause, then tucked it around her knees like she'd done it 100 times before. "You from far?" She nodded. "Parents." Another nod, then a shake, which meant, had once, but not anymore. The wagon creaked on. By the time they reached the rise above town, dusk had begun its slow descent. Lights winked to life in the saloon windows, and smoke drifted from the chimney of the chapel. He glanced at her again, saw how her shoulders had slumped the barest inch. "You hungry?" "No," she lied. He turned the mule away from Main Street. "Room above the store ain't worth the price. Walls thin enough to hear snoring from both sides." She didn't ask where they were going instead. She simply held tighter to the satchel and stared into the snow. The house stood alone, down a road few wagons bothered with unless they were lost or stubborn. It had the look of a place once loved, now simply kept. Porch sagging, fence missing 2 posts, but the barn was tidy and the woodpile neat. He led her inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. She stood in the entry, still clutching her bag like a lifeline. Her eyes flicked over the hearth, the rocking chair, the picture frame turned face down on the mantel. "You can rest here a bit," he said, not quite looking at her. She stepped inside, silent as falling ash. "There's a spare room. Needs dusting." "I can do that." He glanced up. She was already pulling off her gloves. Later, after she'd cleaned the room and lit the lamp without asking, he handed her a bowl of stew. She took it with both hands, whispered thanks, so soft it might have been only breath. They sat at the table, not opposite, but beside. She ate like someone who wasn't sure when she'd next be allowed. He drank coffee and stared at the window, though the night offered nothing but wind and dark. "You didn't have to bring me here," she said, after the bowl was empty and the quiet had stretched long. "I know. I won't stay long. You can rest." She hesitated. Then softer. "I was supposed to marry today." He nodded. But he never even showed. That kind of man don't always show up. She looked at him, then really looked, and something in her gaze was not pity or pleading, but recognition. "You live alone?" He nodded. 2 years now. A pause. Then she asked, "Do you miss her?" He didn't answer with words. He just reached for the coffee again, hand steady but slow. That was answer enough. She looked down at her satchel, then out the window. Snow still fell, gentler now, blanketing the world in silence. "You don't seem the type to rescue strangers." "I'm not." "Then why today?" He looked at her too small coat and her spine that hadn't bent despite everything. "Because you didn't ask me to." And in the quiet that followed, something softened between them. Not love, not yet, but a shared knowing, the kind forged by cold nights and unspoken grief. She rose, took her bowl to the sink, and said, "I'll sweep the hearth tomorrow." He nodded. She paused at the hallway, turned slightly. "Thank you." He tipped his head toward the fire. She left him there, sitting with his coffee, listening to the snow tap gentle at the glass. And for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel so empty. The wind outside howled on, but inside the old house, the rocking chair stilled, and the story had only just begun. The morning came shyly, its light creeping over the plains like a secret not yet ready to be spoken. The girl stood by the window in her borrowed room, watching frost curl across the pane. Her breath fogged the glass, and she drew a tiny circle through the mist with one fingertip, then wiped it away, as if ashamed of leaving any mark at all. Downstairs, the widower stirred the stove to life with practiced motions. The kettle hissed, and the old floorboard stretched and complained beneath his boots. He didn't expect her to come down early. He didn't expect much at all. People who've lost enough learn to stop expecting. But there she was, hair braided down her back, sleeves rolled, apron already dusted with flour. "You don't have to work," he said, without looking up. She nodded once and continued kneading dough with quiet purpose. "I need to," she answered simply. By the time the sun reached the windows, the scent of biscuits mingled with wood smoke and old memories. The table, which had seen too many silent mornings, bore 2 plates now. She didn't sit until he did. They ate without rush, without chatter. She glanced up only once to ask where he kept the wash basin. He pointed. She nodded, then rose to scrub both plates until they gleamed. The day unfolded gently. She found the broom and swept the floor with rhythmic grace, every stroke smoothing something in her chest. He went out to tend the goats, pausing only once when he saw her on her knees beside the hearth, brushing away cobwebs that hadn't been touched in over a year. He hadn't told her to, but she seemed to know the house wanted to be lived in again. The rocker on the porch creaked faintly as the wind moved through it. The widower fixed the gatepost, glancing back once in a while to see her hanging curtains out to beat the dust free. Each task she took up without question, not out of duty, but because it gave her something to claim. That night they shared another meal, potatoes and greens she'd found in the cellar. He said little, just nodded in quiet approval. She accepted it like a gift. When the preacher came 2 days later, it was with a Bible in one hand and a half bottle of cherry cordial in the other. His horse stood steaming in the cold, and his breath fogged the glass of the kitchen window as he knocked politely. The widower opened the door, blinking against the sharp sun. "Thought I'd check on the girl," the preacher said. "Heard tell she never made it to her groom." And yet here she is. She came to the door herself, shoulders square, hands folded at her waist. "I'm not his," she said quietly, glancing at the widower, then back to the preacher. "He just helped. Girl like you, staying with a man alone. Folk will talk." "They always do," she replied. The preacher cleared his throat, stepped inside when invited, and warmed himself by the stove. "You need protection," he said after a pause. "A name to stand under. A ring on your hand." "I had a name," she said. "He never showed up for it." "You could marry this man," he said, motioning toward the widower. "A quick ceremony. Legal and clean. Keep tongues from wagging. Keep trouble off your back." The widower's hands froze on the edge of the table. He didn't raise his eyes. She looked at him, not with pleading, but with a kind of calm. "Would you?" His gaze lifted slowly. "Marriage is a word with weight. I've carried heavier," she said. The preacher leaned forward. "You don't have to love each other. Only mean it. The law don't care how deep the river runs, just that it runs straight." Silence settled like dusk. The widower rose, poured 3 cups of coffee, sat down again. "I don't offer much," he said. "Just a roof, some land, a quiet life." She sipped from her cup, then placed it down with care. "Quiet is fine. You'd be free to go if ever you wanted." "I've never been free before." And that was the moment. Not a proposal, not a declaration. Just 2 people speaking across the table, steady as stones in a stream. The preacher married them that evening by the hearth, with snow drifting slow outside and the fire casting long shadows across the floor. There was no dress, no music, just a single nod from her and a murmur of vows from him, voice rasped from years of disuse. When it was done, she didn't weep. He didn't smile. But the preacher said softly, "Amen," and something in the room exhaled. After he rode off, the girl returned to the kitchen and wiped the table clean, like any other night. The widower brought in more wood. They passed each other in the hall, close but not touching. At the doorway of the room that used to be for guests, she paused. "I'll stay here," she said. "If that's all right." He nodded. "As long as you need." She looked at him one last time that night, her eyes dry but deep. "I'm not broken," she said. "I know." The lamp flickered, then steadied. She closed the door behind her, and though the house still bore its silences, they no longer felt like wounds. They felt like space, space for healing, for breath, for something not yet spoken, but waiting. Outside, the snow fell again, soundless and slow, as if the sky itself was learning to start over. Spring came in pieces, not all at once, but in hesitant signs, mud on the wagon wheels, birds returning in pairs, a green shoot pressing up through last year's dead garden. The wind softened. The sun lingered longer over the hills. And in the quiet space between winter's retreat and summer's promise, the house began to feel less like a monument and more like a home. She planted rows with her sleeves rolled and dirt under her nails, humming as she worked. He rebuilt the broken porch rail without comment, using tools she'd oiled and set out the night before. They moved in orbit of each other, rarely touching, but never colliding. Every day was shaped by small kindnesses. She patched his shirts with even stitches. He left a mug of warm tea outside her door on mornings when her sleep ran long. Neither called it love, but neither questioned it either. They ate every meal together now, always at the same table, always in silence until the second or third bite, when one would offer a word or two, and the other would answer. "How many goats do you have?" "7. "They all got names?" "No, just one. She's the mean one." She laughed, quick and surprised, and it startled them both. Her laughter had a brightness the house had never heard before. He didn't smile, exactly, but his shoulders eased. Later, she read a book by the fire, mouthing the words under her breath. He carved a new yoke for the mule, smoothing the wood like it mattered. Outside, rain tapped softly on the windows, and the rhythm of 2 lives moving beside each other grew into habit. One evening, without thinking, she sat in a chair across from his at the fire, the one that had been his wife's. He didn't flinch, didn't even glance at it, just poured her a cup of tea and handed it over, his hand brushing hers for a second too long. That night, she didn't close her door all the way. By summer, the garden had bloomed into stubborn color. Peas climbed the trellis. Squash flowers flared open in the morning sun. Children from the neighbor's homestead ran through the fence gap to steal handfuls of berries and shout nonsense in the fields. She laughed with them. She taught one to braid grass. The neighbor's wife watched her with narrow eyes at first, then softer, then offered her a pie recipe. But the whispers had begun before the frost left the ground. She heard them at the well and at the mercantile, women leaning toward one another like cattails in wind. She's a throwaway bride. Must have tricked him. Too pretty to be that quiet. I'd give a year. She heard. She didn't speak of it. Instead, she worked harder. Made jam from blackberries. Took soup to the woman 2 farms down who'd lost a baby. She kept her head high and her hands busy. But he noticed. The way her smile faded when she thought she was alone. The way she scrubbed the table a second too long, or stared at the wash like it had said something cruel. "You're not what they say," he said one evening, as they shelled peas together in the fading light. She paused, then shrugged. "They don't say it to you. I still hear it." She looked at him then, the bowl in her lap forgotten. "I didn't come here to take anything from anyone. I know. I didn't think you'd keep me. I didn't think I would either," he said. "But I did." The words sat between them, warm and strange. A week later, a storm rolled in fast, lightning spidering across the sky, wind howling down the chimney. She stood by the window, rigid, eyes wide as thunder cracked. He saw her hand tremble, saw how her lips moved with no sound. He crossed the room and placed a blanket over her shoulders. She didn't turn. "When I was little," she whispered, "storms meant we had to hide. From my uncle. He drank when it rained." He didn't say a word, just stood beside her until the thunder passed. The next morning, she was in the barn before dawn, tending the goats with a fierce quiet. He brought her coffee, left it on the rail, and stood watching as she worked, mud to her knees, hair loose, jaw set. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. She kept working, her voice low. "If I don't, who will?" That night she sang. Not for him, but to herself. A soft melody from somewhere east of here. The kind of song meant for rocking chairs and firelight. He stood in the hallway, out of sight, holding his breath as if it might break the moment. She never sang again after that. Not aloud. But the silence she left behind was full of melody. One morning, they walked the garden rows side by side, discussing which fence to mend. He said, "We could get a second cow come fall." She nodded. "You'd need a new shed then." "You'd be all right staying another winter?" She looked at him. "You'd be all right if I didn't." He stopped walking. "I'd miss you," he said simply. She didn't answer, but her hand brushed his when they reached the gate. Not by accident. And when they returned to the house, she set 2 cups at the table again. The second one no longer felt borrowed. It felt right. It felt like it belonged. That night, as they cleared dishes together, she touched his wrist and said, "Thank you for never asking too much." He looked at her, eyes steady. "Thank you for giving more than you had to." And they stood there, 2 chairs behind them, 1 table between them, and something rising between their shadows that neither dared name. Not yet, but which both could feel. Love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just shows up for supper, washes its hands, and sits down beside you. The heat came early that year, rising off the plains in long, shimmering lines. The garden lay heavy under the weight of ripening fruit, and even the goats lazed in the shade, chewing slowly, unconcerned. Inside the house, the air moved only when she passed through it, her skirt brushing the floor like wind in tall grass. She'd taken to baking in the mornings, when the sun hadn't yet made the stove unbearable. Biscuits, sometimes pies, left on the windowsill to cool beside jars of jam that caught the light like stained glass. He would ride out before breakfast to check the fence lines, and return by mid-morning dusty and sweat-darkened, grateful for the quiet rhythm she brought with her. They had settled. Not in the way young lovers settle into one another's arms, but in the way roots settle into deep, undisturbed soil. They spoke less, but heard more, shared glances that held whole conversations. laughed low and easy over small things, an ornery goat, a stuck wagon wheel, the preacher's bad harmonica playing drifting up from Sunday service. But peace in the West is a thin curtain, and sometimes the wind tears it down. He rode up at noon, dust on his boots and a sour look in his eyes. "There's a man in town asking about you," he said. Not unkind, but not soft either. She stopped stirring batter. "What does he want?" "Says he bought himself a bride." Says she ran off. Her hand didn't tremble, but her voice turned to stone. "I didn't run. I know. He never came for me." "He knows that too," the widower said. "He don't care." She wiped her hands on her apron, slow and steady. "What will he do?" He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "He's got money. He's used to getting what he pays for." She looked out the window, eyes narrowed at something far away. "I was a receipt to him, a line in a ledger." "You're not anymore." "I'm still not his," she whispered. "No," he said. "You're mine now." It was the first time either of them had said it aloud. It didn't sound like a claim. It sounded like shelter. That evening, as the sun dropped behind a ridge and the sky turned copper, the man arrived. He came on a chestnut horse, coat too fine for the dust, face too clean for a summer day. Two others followed, wide men with cold eyes and twitching hands. He didn't dismount, just sat tall in the saddle at the edge of the yard and said, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." She stepped onto the porch herself, arms folded, her dress still dusted with flour. She didn't flinch. "I belong to no one," she said. "You were promised," he snapped. "I was sold." Same thing. The widower stepped out beside her then, quiet but solid as an oak. "She's my wife." "I have papers," the man said, pulling them from his coat and waving them like proof of divinity. "Signed, sealed, and paid for. You're harboring stolen goods." "She's not a good," he replied. "You think a farm ring and a kitchen makes her yours?" "No, she does." The hired men shifted in their saddles, hungry for a command. The horses stamped the ground. "You've got until sundown," the man said. "Then I come back, and I take what's mine." They watched him ride off, his coat snapping like a flag. She didn't speak, just went inside, stripped off her apron, and sat at the table, hands folded like in prayer. He followed, poured her a cup of tea though she didn't ask for it. "I'll leave if you want me to," she said at last. "I won't bring you trouble." "You're not trouble," he answered. "I'm a storm waiting to happen." He sat across from her, slow and steady. Then let it come. That night, he moved a chair in front of the door, laid the rifle across his lap. She didn't stop him, didn't tell him to be careful, just brought him a quilt and draped it over his legs before going to bed, without closing the door behind her. The preacher came at dawn, his hat in hand, eyes heavy. He says the law is on his side. The law can't see through money. "I've seen men lose worse than land over less than this." The widower nodded. "I won't hand her over." The preacher lowered his voice. "There's another way. If she runs now, heads east, I know a family who'd hide her." But the girl stepped forward before either man could speak again. "I'm done running," she said. "I'd rather fight where I'm known than hide where I'm not." He looked at her like a man seeing the edge of something holy. She spent the day in the garden, pulling weeds, humming to the squash blossoms, watching clouds gather like cavalry on the horizon. When the man returned, he wasn't smiling. This time he dismounted, walked slow up the path, boots clean, gloves tighter than before. "I came civil once," he said. "That's more than most get." She stood on the porch again, beside the man who had married her not for beauty or bargain, but because she had needed a place to be seen. "This is your last chance," the suitor snarled. "No," she said, voice like polished stone. "It's yours." Then the town came. First the preacher, then the woman from the next farm, then the shopkeeper, the livery boy, and even the sheriff, hat crooked, eyes wary. They didn't shout. They didn't brandish rifles. They stood, because they had watched her pull splinters from children's fingers, watched her kneel beside a sick lamb, watched her walk through whispers without bending once. "She's not going anywhere," said the preacher. "And if you think she is, you'll have to go through all of us." The man stared at them, chest heaving, face red. He looked at the sheriff, who only shrugged. "This ain't a town that favors thieves," he said. "Even the legal kind." The man spat, cursed, mounted his horse, and rode off. No one cheered. No one clapped. They simply turned and walked home again, as if nothing had happened at all. That night, the girl sat beside the widower on the porch, feet bare, hands folded. "You could have let me go," she said softly. "I never wanted to. I never thought I'd be worth the trouble." "You're not." She looked at him. "You're worth the whole damn storm." And the rocking chair creaked as she leaned into him, and the sky broke open with rain. But inside the house, nothing leaked. Nothing faltered, because they had built it together, and it was stronger than anyone had thought. Snow returned like a slow apology, late in the season, soft as breath on glass, falling through a windless sky in thick, deliberate silence. It blanketed the garden rows now stripped bare, clung to the rails of the porch, and buried the split which stacked neatly beside the door. Inside the house, the fire burned low, steady as a heartbeat, casting flickering shadows across two pairs of boots drying by the hearth. She sat cross-legged on the rug, mending the hem of a coat that had long since stopped belonging to anyone, but had earned its place by lasting. He sat nearby, sharpening a blade in slow, measured strokes, each pass over the whetstone echoing like distant footsteps. Winter had folded around them, and yet they'd never felt more awake. They didn't speak often now, not from silence, but from understanding. There was little left unsaid between them. She knew the way he stirred sugar into her tea before she reached for it. He knew the sound of her footsteps from room to room and what each rhythm meant. They moved like people who had built something not loud or grand, but honest. And still, the past hadn't disappeared. It returned in a letter, a folded parchment delivered by a boy too young to know the weight of what he carried. She opened it at the table, eyes scanning the words once, then again. He waited, not asking. She laid it flat between them, fingers pressed to the corners. "He's petitioned the court," she said, "to challenge our marriage. Claims I entered it under false pretenses. Says I was always his." The widower said nothing for a moment, then stood, poured her a glass of water with steady hands. "He can't touch you here. He's trying." The paper felt colder than the snow outside. She turned it over, as though looking at its back might soften what was printed. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. He sat beside her, one hand resting over hers. "We hold." The days passed slower after that, heavy with waiting. The preacher came by with a lawyer's name just in case. The sheriff rode out twice, watching the road. But there was no noise, no knock, no smoke on the horizon, only the growing cold and the awareness that something was drawing breath just outside their reach. She never said it, but the fear lived behind her eyes again. Not like before, not sharp and panicked, but dulled and tired, the kind of fear that comes from knowing the world often chooses power over truth. One night, he woke to the sound of her crying. Not loud, just a quiet weep into the quilt, like she didn't want to disturb even the house. He didn't speak. He simply placed his hand on her back, warm and unmoving, until she stopped shaking. "Do you think we'll lose?" she asked. "No," he said. "But even if we do, I won't let them take you." "How can you promise that?" "Because I would rather bury him myself." She didn't flinch at the words. She only closed her eyes and breathed as though, for the first time, she believed him. The snow thickened over the next week. Roads vanished. Smoke curled upward from every chimney in town like prayers rising. Then, just before dawn one morning, hoofbeats cracked the stillness. She was already at the window when he woke, her figure barely more than a silhouette framed against the pale, white-blue light. He rose without asking, dressed without hurry. "They've come," she said, voice calm and hollow. He looked out the window. A small procession moved through the snow. 3 riders, one of them a man in a black coat far too fine for travel. Behind them, a covered sleigh. He turned to her. "You don't have to face this." "Yes, I do." The sleigh stopped at the edge of the yard. She stepped into her boots, wrapped her shawl tight, and met them on the porch with her chin high and her hand steady. The man dismounted with practiced grace, like someone who'd made a life of stepping onto other people's land. "I've come with a ruling," he said, flashing papers like a badge. Your marriage is invalid. The law recognizes the original agreement. You're mine by contract. She stood as still as she had that first day at the station, small, silent, but unbroken. You never met me, she said. You never spoke to me. You bought a name on a line. You accepted the fare. I was told I had no choice. He stepped forward. You're coming with me. Now, the widower appeared then, rifle in his hand but lowered. His face carried no heat, only resolve. A man made not of fire, but stone. She's not going. I have law on my side. You have a piece of paper. I'll take her by force. Try, the widower said, eyes never leaving his. The man shifted, eyes flicking to his men. Then the town came again. From behind fences. Down the road. Through the snow. They came with lanterns and shovels, coats pulled close, but hearts uncovered. The preacher. The shopkeeper. The neighbor with a child on her hip. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. They just stood. The man looked at them all, at the rifles that stayed slung but ready, at the eyes that didn't blink. Then he laughed, bitter and short. You're fools. She'll bring you nothing but ruin. She brought us bread when we were hungry, said the neighbor. She taught my son his letters, said the preacher. She gave more than she ever asked for, said the shopkeeper. The man's face turned red beneath the cold. You'll regret this. But no one moved, and in the silence that followed, she stepped down from the porch, walked past the man, past the sleigh, stopped beside the preacher. Would you write something for me? She asked. He nodded. To whom it may concern, she said. I am not lost property. I am not unfinished business. I am not a bargain gone bad. I am a woman, and I choose to stay. The preacher wrote it out on the back of the same court paper the man had brought, and handed it back to her. She turned and pressed it into his chest. You have your ruling. Now take your name and go. The man stood there, unmoving. Then he turned, climbed into his sleigh, and disappeared into the snow without another word. She didn't watch him leave. She simply walked back to the house, opened the door, stepped inside, and this time she shut it behind her. He was there, waiting. She unlaced her boots and crossed the room without pause, without fear. He took her hands, rough and cold, and pressed them to his chest. You stayed, he said. She nodded. You made it safe too. And then he kissed her, not out of passion, not to claim, but as a promise kept. Outside, the snow continued to fall, steady and slow, softening every edge. And in the little house on the ridge, the fire burned warm, 2 chairs pulled close, and no one left waiting at the station.